war is a beast all its own, a relentless, devouring force. But through the centuries, there have been whispers, stories from soldiers who swear they encountered something more than human. Men who thought they'd seen it all, only to be plunged into a kind of terror they never believed possible. According to these accounts, the real threat on the battlefield may not always wear a human face. One chilling report comes from a U.S. Army Special Forces soldier, anonymous for his own safety. He and his team were deep in the mountains of Afghanistan, tracking a high-value Taliban target. Their mission was straightforward: watch a nearby village for several days, gather intel, then plan a precise strike. 8 men total, 6 at their base, 2 closer to the village. Right from the start, things felt off. The radios crackled with static, making it nearly impossible to maintain contact. They figured the mineral-rich rocks were messing with their equipment. So, near dusk, the witness and a few others headed out to adjust their SATCOM, hoping to get a decent signal. That's when one of them spotted a figure, a man draped in white, darting among the rocky crags outside the village. Already worried about being compromised, the team packed up fast, all nerves on high alert as they retreated in the creeping dark. The witness remembers carefully covering their tracks, yet every so often he glimpsed something pale flicker in the distance. Eventually he spoke up. An officer confirmed he'd seen it too. Whatever it was tailing them. The tension grew razor sharp. They were few, exposed, and cut off from proper comms. And there was something else. A clinging heaviness in the air, almost sickly sweet, and a silence that pressed in on them like a living thing. Under the cover of night, they switched to their nods, night vision goggles, hoping to spot their stalker, but they saw nothing and no one. Still, the worst was yet to come. In the soldier's own words, what happened next defied logic. It began with a deep droning noise, like a massive plane revving its engines, then rising in pitch until they had to shout to hear each other. Everywhere he looked, he thought he saw eyes glowing in the dark. But whenever he focused on one spot, those eyes vanished. The group was on the brink of panic, weapons raised, expecting an ambush at any moment. Then, without warning, it all just stopped. The darkness swallowed them again, the only sound their own ragged breathing. They halted, dug in, and waited, listening to the night. For 10 long minutes, nothing made a sound, not even insects. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath. Exhausted and unnerved, they pressed on, desperate to return to camp. But they weren't alone. Something was out there in that blackness, and the feeling it gave them was anything but friendly. They pushed through the brush until they saw him. A lone man dressed in pale robes approaching at a slow, deliberate pace. His movement was wrong. He seemed to glide over the rocks like they weren't even there. Through the goggles, the soldier saw the figure's eyes glimmering back at him. Pitch dark all around, yet the man seemed to see them perfectly. Then he paused, lifted one limb high, almost as if waving, until that limb melted back into his silhouette, morphing from what looked like an arm into something more like a probing appendage. The soldier tried to ask if anyone else was seeing this too, but the figure vanished right before their eyes. Rattled beyond words, the team finally stumbled back to base. In the distance, they noticed flickering lights near the village, but wrote them off in the chaos. Not until days later did they learn what happened. Another unit had gone in to raid that village only to find it abandoned. They discovered several bodies, men torn apart in a way that defied explanation. There was so much blood, so much evidence of violence, that it suggested more victims than the remains they counted. Officially, it went on record as a successful mission, with multiple enemy casualties. Unofficially, nobody knew what could have done it. As for the anonymous Special Forces soldier, He remains convinced that whatever they'd encountered chose those villagers instead of him and his team. To this day, no one can explain what they saw that night, or what lurked in the darkness beyond human understanding. What do you think this group encountered? I originally posted this story on a paranormal subreddit a while ago, and honestly, I've been torn about whether to share it again. But ever since I did, people have been messaging me privately, either telling me they've had similar experiences or asking for more details, so I figured it might help someone else if I just put it all out there and let people draw their own conclusions. I'm not saying I have any firm answers, because the older I get, the more I realize how little we actually understand about the world around us. My experience took place mostly in northern Wisconsin, specifically in the region around the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, which spans a huge area. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically a sprawling stretch of woods, lakes, bogs, and old logging roads. It's one of those spots where you can drive for miles without seeing another car, and once you leave the main highways, your cell phone signal might as well not exist. I've lived in Wisconsin most of my life, and a large chunk of my extended family is from the Ashland-Bayfield area. I've been hunting, fishing, and camping around there since I was a kid, so I know the land pretty well, or at least I thought I did. The whole thing started in the summer of 2017. I had gone up to a friend's family cabin near Muqua Barrens to spend a long weekend away from work. This friend, let's call him D, has a cabin that his grandfather built back in the 1950s. A simple little structure with no electricity, just a wood stove and some gas lamps. It sits a decent distance off one of those old logging roads, surrounded by trees so thick that you can't see the sky unless you're directly above the clearing. We plan to fish during the day at Lake Superior, about a 25-minute drive, and at night just hang out by the fire, maybe break out the guitars. The first couple of days were uneventful. We fished, we grilled, we drank a bit, and just unwound. The weather was perfect. Sunny, clear, no humidity. On the third day, a Monday, I woke up early because I had to use the outhouse. It must have been around 6 a.m., the sun barely up. As I walked out there, I noticed an odd smell in the air. It was faint, something like rotting vegetation mixed with a wet dog odor. I figured maybe some critter or a deer had died nearby, or maybe a raccoon got into something and dragged it under the cabin. But the smell vanished as soon as I finished up, so I brushed it off. Later that afternoon, we drove into Ashland to get some groceries, and on our way back, we saw a couple of deer cross the logging road a few hundred yards ahead. Nothing unusual. This area is full of deer. But Dee said something like, "They're running like something spooked them." They were bolting, not the typical cautious trot. We slowed down, but by the time we reached that spot, the deer were long gone. We joked that maybe a bear was tracking them, which happens often enough. We made dinner, sat around outside, and as the sun started to set, I recall the woods went dead quiet. Usually around dusk, you hear all sorts of life. Crickets, birds, frogs if you're near a marshy spot. But it was so quiet, it made my ears ring. Dee noticed it too, and we even laughed that it felt like we were in a horror movie, waiting for some jump scare. Then, out of nowhere, a series of howls started up deep in the woods. Now, we do have wolves in Wisconsin, and I've heard them many times. But these howls were pitched strangely, almost like a cross between a wolf and someone trying to imitate a wolf. They came in clusters of 3 or 4, then went silent, then started up again. We couldn't pinpoint the direction. Sometimes it sounded east, sometimes south. It definitely wasn't just one animal. Dee was uneasy, but we tried not to let it ruin the evening. We stoked the fire, told ourselves it was a couple of wolves, and that was that. That night, though, I had trouble sleeping. Partly because of the howling, partly because that's just how I am. I drifted in and out until maybe 2 a.m., and that's when I heard footsteps outside the cabin. The underbrush and twigs snapping. I was sure someone or something was walking around. It circled the cabin slowly, judging by the sound, then seemed to move off into the trees. I was terrified, but also half asleep. I thought about waking Dee, but he's a heavy sleeper and I just wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. Eventually, I dozed off again and told him about it the next morning. He shrugged, said maybe a deer wandered close to the house. We decided to head back to civilization a day early because the vibe was just off. The howling, the smell, the nighttime footsteps. It was enough to put me on edge. Dee had to be back at work soon anyway, so we packed up and left on Tuesday afternoon. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror like I expected something to come running out of the woods. Nothing happened, of course, and life went on. Things escalated in late August of that same year. Another friend of mine, Mark, who lived just outside Mellon, called me up, insisting I come check something out on his property. Now, Mark is a real salt-of-the-earth guy, not prone to panic or storytelling. He said that over the past month he'd been hearing snarls at night, which he first assumed were coyotes or even a lone wolf. But then he found footprints in the soft earth by his barn. They were large, about the size of a human foot, but the toes seemed elongated, and it had a shape that looked more canine than human. He'd also been finding shredded bits of fur near his trash cans, like something was killing small animals around his land. He wasn't sure if it was a bobcat or what, but the footprints confused him enough to call me, thinking I might have encountered something similar. I drove up one weekend to see for myself. Sure enough, there were weird tracks in the mud by his barn door. The prints were maybe 6 or 7 inches wide, and you could make out a distinct pad shape plus 4 toe impressions. But the stride between them seemed too long for a regular dog, almost as if this thing had a bipedal gait at times, but not always. Mark said he didn't see it directly, just heard the snarling and the occasional thump on his porch at night. We spent an entire Saturday evening scanning the property with flashlights. Around 11 p.m., we heard something that sounded like a cough or bark coming from the edge of the woods. We pointed our lights over, and for a split second, I saw the reflection of eyes, yellowish green, low to the ground. Then they vanished. That was enough for me, so we went back inside. Fast forward to mid-September. I came across an article in a local paper about unidentified canid sightings in Ashland County. The piece quoted a few residents who claimed they saw a dog-like creature standing on 2 legs along County Road GG. One woman said it chased her car for a short stretch before darting off into the woods. Another claimed she saw it crouched by the ditch, tearing into roadkill. Of course, a lot of folks dismissed it as a wolf with mange or a large coyote or even a misidentified bear. But the detail that stuck with me was how everyone described it as having unnaturally long front legs, and that it moved strangely, which lined up with Mark's experience of the weird footprints. I began poking around online forums, reading up on cryptid canines and sightings of creatures known as Dogman. The more I read, the more unsettled I became, because there were plenty of stories from Michigan and Wisconsin that matched the pattern. Rural roads, deer kills, weird howling, large prints, and occasional sightings of a wolf-like creature standing upright. Usually I'd treat these stories with a big dose of skepticism, but I couldn't deny how closely they paralleled what Mark was dealing with. And I remembered the footsteps I'd heard around Dee's cabin. Could it have been the same thing? Later that year in October, I was invited by my cousin to join a deer hunting party near Clam Lake. The early bow season was in full swing, and we planned to camp for a few days. Normally, I'm pretty confident in the woods, but after the weirdness over the summer, I couldn't shake a sense of dread. Still, I went figuring safety in numbers. There were 4 of us, all armed with bows and 1 rifle just in case, though it wasn't rifle season yet. The first day was uneventful, just the typical waiting in a tree stand, hearing the rustle of squirrels. Around dusk, however, I noticed a sudden drop in temperature. Maybe it was just the sun going down, but it felt like the air got colder than it should. Then the forest went silent again, just like at Dee's cabin. No wind, no birds, nothing. My hair stood on end, as if I'd been electrically charged. I stayed in the stand until it was almost too dark to see. Then I climbed down and started heading back to the camp. I had about a 15-minute walk. I kept hearing these faint snaps of twigs behind me, matching my pace. When I stopped, it stopped. When I walked, it walked. I tried to look over my shoulder casually, but I never saw a thing. By the time I reached camp, my nerves were shot. My cousin and the others were already there, huddled around a small fire. I casually asked if anyone heard anything strange on the way back. They just shook their heads, said it was a normal evening. I decided not to press it. I didn't sleep well that night, though I didn't hear anything else out of the ordinary. The next morning, we found large, fresh footprints about 50 yards from camp in a patch of wet dirt near a small stream. They were similar to the ones at M's place, big, canine-like, but not quite dog. My cousin took pictures with his phone, cursing that he didn't have plaster to make a cast. We joked that maybe it was a huge wolf looking for an easy meal, but everyone was a little on edge. We ended up leaving a day early again because it felt too creepy staying there. On the drive back, I got into a discussion with my cousin about the old legends of the Wisconsin werewolf. The Beast of Bray Road near Elkhorn is probably the most famous example. But folks around these parts have been whispering about upright canines for decades. The more I read, the more I suspect that we might have our own pockets of undiscovered wildlife, or something else entirely. Maybe it's misidentification, or maybe there's a small population of cryptid canines that roam the forests, rarely seen. I'm not saying that's fact, just that I can't explain what we encountered otherwise. Early in 2018, I reached out to a few local cryptid and paranormal groups, some folks who investigate these sorts of reports. A couple of them were really receptive and said they'd been collecting sightings all around the Great Lakes region. One person mentioned that certain areas of the Chequamegon-Nicolet Forest seemed to be hot spots, particularly near logging roads and places that are less traversed by humans. They also noted a spike in sightings after especially mild winters, possibly suggesting the creatures have an easier time coming out to hunt if conditions don't push them deeper into remote areas. I even heard from one guy who claimed to be a retired DNR, Department of Natural Resources, employee. He insisted that the state government is well aware that strange canid creatures roam parts of Wisconsin and Michigan, but chooses not to acknowledge it publicly. He said they prefer to label sightings as simple wolf or bear encounters to avoid panic. Now, I can't confirm his credentials, and he didn't provide proof, so take it with a grain of salt. Still, it fed into my growing suspicion that there's more to the story than meets the eye. At one point, I thought about returning to Dee's cabin with a better camera, maybe some trail cams, and try to capture evidence. Dee was open to the idea, but warned me that being out there for a prolonged period, especially overnight, might not be the smartest move if we suspect a large predatory creature. We never got around to it, mainly because schedules didn't line up, and also because part of me didn't want to push my luck. Sometimes it's better to leave things alone, especially if you don't fully understand what you're dealing with. The last strange occurrence I'll mention happened in late April 2018. Mark called me again in a near panic, saying something tried to break into his barn at night. He found deep scratch marks on the wooden door, 3 parallel lines, each about a foot long, gouged into the surface. He also found tufts of grayish-brown fur stuck in the splinters. He actually took some pictures and sent them to me. It looked coarse, not like typical dog fur, and the color was off for a wolf. He said he was going to rig a motion sensor alarm on his property. As far as I know, it's been relatively quiet since then, but he keeps a loaded rifle by his bedside, which is not something he used to do. So that's more or less where the saga sits. I haven't had another direct run-in myself, aside from the occasional uneasy feeling when I'm out hunting. But I still think about those tracks, and the howls, and the sense that something followed me out of the woods. It leaves me with more questions than answers. Are we dealing with a natural creature? A misidentified wolf with some genetic mutation? Or something else altogether? Could there be pockets of these upright canines surviving in remote forests? Rarely seen, but enough to spawn local legends? All I know is that I grew up skeptical. Even though I liked reading about cryptids, I never truly believed in them. Now, I'm open to the possibility that the world is a lot stranger than I'd assumed. I don't blame anyone for rolling their eyes at my story. I might have done the same a few years ago. But there's something out there in those woods, something that leaves footprints too large for a normal wolf and moves with an unnerving intelligence. And for me, that's enough to make me think twice before going out alone after dark on those old logging roads. I'm not trying to spread fear. I just want people to know that if they hear those weird howls or see those tracks, they're not alone in wondering what in the world is roaming those dense Wisconsin forests. I wish I had concrete proof or a neat conclusion that would solve the mystery. But life doesn't always wrap things up with a bow. Sometimes you get a glimpse of something in the corner of your eye or find evidence that doesn't fit any category, and you have to live with that gray area. If you spend enough time in wild places, especially the kind that don't see human traffic for days or weeks, you realize how small and clueless we really are. Whether it's some undiscovered species, a rare genetic offshoot, or a flat-out supernatural entity, I can't say. But I believe that our ancestors weren't just making up tales to scare children around the campfire. There might be some real substance behind these old stories of wolf men or dog-like beings that walk on two legs. That's what happened, for whatever it's worth. If you ever find yourself hiking or camping in the Chequamegon-Nicolet area, keep your wits about you. Listen carefully to the sounds of the forest, especially when they suddenly go silent. And if you smell that wet dog meets rot stench or see footprints that don't quite match anything you know, don't stick around. The Northwoods hold more secrets than we care to admit, and sometimes it's best to respect the unknown and let it stay unknown. I've been hesitant to share this publicly for a long time, because it's one of those experiences that can't be easily explained or verified. And I've always been the type who needs a logical reason for everything. But the further I get from it in time, the more I feel like I need to get it off my chest, even if it just sounds like rambling to most people. I grew up in a small town on the West Virginia side of the Ohio River, not too far from Point Pleasant. I know that area is famous, or infamous depending on who you ask, for all sorts of strange sightings. Most folks immediately think of the Mothman, but what I experienced wasn't related to anything with wings or red eyes. It was something else entirely, though it still disturbs me. And I can't help but feel it ties into all the other weirdness that hovers around those Appalachian hills. The first incident happened sometime in early March 2019. I remember it was a Saturday because I'd just gotten off a long work week and decided to drive down to Huntington to visit an old college friend. The plan was to grab a late lunch, hang out by the riverfront, and maybe poke around Pullman Square if the weather cooperated. It was chilly, windy, the kind of day where the clouds seem permanently stuck overhead. But it wasn't raining or anything like that. I left home around 11 in the morning and took Route 2 most of the way, which runs parallel to the Ohio River. It's a drive I've done countless times, so I typically go on autopilot. Not too far past Gallipolis Ferry, I noticed something in the sky that I initially mistook for a plane. It was a metallic glint high up, maybe a few miles away, just hovering. Planes don't typically hover like that. I reasoned maybe it was a helicopter, but it was so bright and reflective that I couldn't pin it down. I tried to keep my eyes on the road and occasionally glance at whatever it was. Then, in a matter of seconds, it shot across the sky to the west and vanished behind some trees. The speed was incredible, faster than any aircraft I've seen at that altitude. It seemed unnatural. But I was running late, so I shrugged it off, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, or it was a drone someone was testing. That was the first time I ever saw anything unusual like that, at least that I remember. That evening, while chatting with my friend, I casually brought up the strange object in the sky. He told me that weird lights weren't unheard of around the river. He mentioned an acquaintance who used to fish by the Robert C. Byrd Dam at night, who swore up and down he saw floating spheres of light over the water on multiple occasions. Apparently, these lights would zip around erratically and then blink out. My friend chalked it up to too much beer and fish stories, but he also admitted he's heard more than one person mention seeing those orbs. I guess I filed that information away in my head, but I didn't really connect it to anything deeper at the time. Things took a more unsettling turn about a month later in April. I was staying over at my dad's place just outside of Milton for a few days, helping him clean up the property. He's older and yard work gets harder every year, so I try to visit whenever I can. Late one night, I couldn't sleep. I was lying awake in my old bedroom scrolling aimlessly on my phone. Then I heard a sound that, for lack of a better term, was like electricity crackling right outside the window. It was faint, but it had that static hiss you might hear if you stand under a power transformer. We do have some power lines that run near the edge of the property, so I initially assumed maybe there was an electrical short or some issue with the lines. I set my phone down, got up, and looked outside. The yard was dimly lit by a security light near the garage, and at first glance I didn't see anything out of place. After a minute or two, I caught a glimpse of a bright greenish glow, sort of a quick flash, near the tree line. It reminded me of a firefly, but way bigger and more intense, and it pulsed for a second, then died. Feeling curious, I tiptoed out onto the back porch. The night was cool and still, no wind, just the faint hum of frogs or crickets. And then I heard the crackling sound again, maybe 15 or 20 yards away. It was accompanied by a gentle rustling, like someone shifting branches, but I couldn't see a thing. It was too dark. I stood there for about 5 minutes before giving up, concluding it might have been an animal or some short in the security light's wiring. The next morning, my dad mentioned that his dog, Max, had been whining at the back door around 3 in the morning. He found Max pacing and growling low at something outside, but every time he opened the door, the dog refused to step out. That's odd because Max is usually fearless. He's part German Shepherd, part unknown. Dad also said he thought he heard a metallic humming around the same time, but he was too groggy to investigate. It was strange enough that we spent a good part of the day looking around the yard for any sign of damage or footprints. We found nothing except a thin patch of grass near the edge of the fence that was flattened in a spiral shape, maybe 3 feet across. Could have been a deer bedding down, I guess. It had that circular pattern, though, which deer beds usually don't. We scratched our heads and then moved on to trimming the hedges, thinking we were making a mountain out of a molehill. By May, I was back at my own place in Mason County, about 30 minutes from the river. One night, I woke up feeling extremely anxious, like I'd had a nightmare but couldn't recall any details. My heart was racing and I was drenched in sweat. I glanced at my phone to check the time. 3:33 a.m. on the dot. I've never been someone who reads too deeply into repeating numbers, but that gave me a chill for some reason. I tried to settle back down, but that anxious feeling wouldn't go away. It was like I sensed someone standing in the hallway or behind the bedroom door. I even got up to check, but everything was normal. It was about an hour before I finally drifted back to sleep. In the weeks that followed, I started having these weird headaches during the day, usually around my temples. They felt almost like a sinus pressure, but none of the usual allergy symptoms came with them. I went to an urgent care once to see if I had an infection or something, but they found nothing unusual. They prescribed a mild pain reliever and told me to keep an eye on it. Around that same time, I began experiencing episodes where I'd lose track of time. I'd be writing an email or washing dishes, and suddenly an hour or two would vanish. At first, I thought it was just me spacing out, maybe due to stress or lack of sleep, but it happened often enough that it raised eyebrows. My boss even asked if I was all right because I was missing deadlines at work. I said I was dealing with migraines, which wasn't entirely a lie. Things came to a head one afternoon in late June. I was invited to a weekend barbecue at my friend's new house near Milton, not far from where my dad lived. I drove out there after finishing some errands, expecting a typical summer gathering of good food and maybe some music. People were hanging out in the backyard around a small fire pit, swapping stories about the storms we'd had earlier that month. One of the guests, I didn't know him, some friend of a friend, started talking about UFO sightings in the region, saying that Cabell County apparently has a decent number of reports. He claimed he saw a triangular craft near the Barbersville Mall one night after closing. He described it as a dark, silent triangle with 3 lights on the corners, gliding over the parking lot. No one else at the table seemed particularly enthralled, but I was riveted because of the weird experiences I'd been having. I asked him if he ever heard a static or metallic hum associated with UFO sightings. He paused, gave me a funny look, and said something like, "Yeah, actually, sometimes people report that. It's like the craft is messing with electromagnetic fields." While we were on that subject, I mentioned the flattened circle in my dad's backyard and the strange glow I saw. He looked genuinely interested and suggested that I try using a compass or some EMF meter around the area to see if it spikes. I laughed it off at the time, thinking I'd come off as a conspiracy theorist if I actually went out with an EMF meter to the yard. But a part of me was extremely curious. A week later, I borrowed one of those cheap EMF detectors from a friend who used to do amateur paranormal investigations at the West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville. Apparently, that place is pretty active, so they say. I drove back to my dad's and walked around the yard, scanning slowly. The readings were totally normal except for one spot near the fence line, right where that spiral of flattened grass had been. It spiked briefly from 0.2 to around 2.0 milligauss and then back down to near zero. That's not exactly earth-shattering, but it was enough to make me scratch my head. There's no buried electrical lines there. Dad had that area surveyed years ago when he put up the fence. Throughout July, I kept noticing small oddities. Lights in the sky at night that wouldn't stay in one place or would zip away too quickly. Flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye when I was outside at night. The same creeping sensation that I was being watched. At some point I started reading about potential government cover-ups or clandestine military projects around Appalachia. I dug into old stories from the Cold War era about rumored underground facilities in rural parts of the state or hush-hush experiments near the Kanawha River. I even read about how the Green Bank Observatory in Pocahontas County keeps a radio quiet zone and wondered if it had any relation to what I was experiencing. Like maybe there's some testing going on that causes electromagnetic anomalies. But I couldn't find anything concrete. A friend of mine from Charleston, who's big into the UFO lore, told me that the region is known for not just aerial phenomena, but also for so-called interdimensional sightings. Like shimmering figures in the woods or ephemeral shapes crossing roads late at night. She said something about how, historically, the entire Appalachian Range has pockets of high strangeness. At that point, I thought I was tumbling down the rabbit hole, letting my imagination get the best of me. So I forced myself to step away from the research. I tried to focus on everyday life, yard work, my job, spending time with friends. That approach worked for a while. I even went a couple of months without anything weird happening, at least nothing that stuck out. Then, in early September, I got a call from my dad around 11 p.m. He never calls that late, so I immediately thought something was wrong. He said he'd gone outside to take the trash around back and saw lights above the tree line, a cluster of 4 or 5 bright white lights that formed a semicircle. They were maybe 100 feet above the ground, completely silent, and they danced around each other in a circular pattern. He watched for a good 5 minutes until one by one they zipped off toward the horizon, leaving no trail. I asked if he managed to snap a picture, but his phone was inside. Typical luck, right? That was the moment I realized this might not be confined to me. At least someone else I trusted was seeing something bizarre. So I drove over there the next day, half hoping to find evidence of scorched grass or a new swirl in the lawn. We found nothing new. My dad insisted he wasn't imagining it. He grew up hunting, fishing, and working on cars. He's not the type to fantasize about UFOs or technology beyond his understanding. His confusion and excitement were genuine, and I believe him, though I can't explain what he saw. A few weeks later, while out for a nighttime walk near my own place, I felt a sudden wave of vertigo. My vision blurred, and for a second I thought I might pass out. I leaned against a street sign until it passed, which took maybe 30 seconds. But during that brief span, I had the strangest sensation of pressure in my ears. It was almost like being underwater or descending quickly in an airplane. When I glanced up at the sky afterward, I saw nothing except the faint glow of the moon through the clouds. But that sense of being watched returned full force. I hurried back inside and locked the door behind me like a child who just saw a scary shadow. It was embarrassing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. In the days that followed, I found myself waking up at odd hours again, typically between 3 and 4 in the morning, with no recollection of any dream or reason to be awake. Just that same unsettling feeling of a presence in the house. Once or twice I thought I saw a movement in the hallway if I left the bedroom door cracked. A quick glance would reveal nothing. It got to the point where I started sleeping with the hallway light on, which felt ridiculous for someone my age. But the anxiety was too strong to ignore. By November, I had enough peculiar experiences and half-clues that I decided to talk to another relative about it, an older cousin who lives in the Beckley area. She's always been open-minded, dabbling in local ghost hunts and reading about paranormal cases. She told me that, in her opinion, what I was describing sounded like a combination of UFO or advanced craft sightings, and possibly even an entity encounter. The kind that sometimes goes hand in hand with missing time or memory lapses. She warned me that I should keep a journal of everything that happens. Specific dates, times, sensations, details of the environment, so that if it continues, I have a record to refer back to. I started doing that, scribbling down notes whenever something odd occurred. That's when I realized that the weird episodes often clustered around new moons, or times when the night sky was at its darkest. I don't know if that's significant or just a coincidence. I'm also aware that writing down every strange feeling or fleeting light in the sky could make anyone a little paranoid. But it gave me some measure of control over the situation. It felt like I was doing something proactive. December came and the holiday season rolled in, family gatherings, gift shopping, end-of-year deadlines at work. I was busy enough that I didn't dwell on the phenomenon much. In fact, I had a pretty peaceful stretch without any bizarre sightings. No missing time, no headaches. Then on December 20th, I was driving back from a friend's Christmas party in Barbersville, heading north on I-64 around 10 p.m. The roads were fairly empty. Out of nowhere, the sky lit up in front of me, not with lightning, but with a bright bluish-white flash that seemed to come from above the cloud cover. It was so sudden that I almost swerved. My first thought was maybe a transformer exploded, but there were no power lines on the interstate. Then I thought it could be a meteor, but I didn't see any streak or trail, just a flash like a giant camera going off. My heart raced as I slowed down, half expecting to see an accident ahead. Everything remained dark except for the faint glow of street lamps. That flash rattled me more than I care to admit. When I finally got home, I checked social media and local news to see if anybody had reported a transformer blowout or something similar. I found nothing. The sky was quiet, no mention of meteors or unusual phenomena. Just me, apparently. It's been a while since then, and I still don't have any solid answers. I can't say for sure if it's extraterrestrial in origin, military testing, or some bizarre natural phenomenon. All I know is that I saw lights in the sky that defy typical flight patterns, heard strange humming and crackling noises around the yard in the dead of night, felt an oppressive sensation that I was being watched, and experienced small gaps in time. My dad, who's the most grounded person I know, also saw something out of the ordinary. That's enough to make me keep my mind open. A part of me wonders if there are hidden military installations in those hills, or if the government knows about these sightings and simply chooses not to acknowledge them. I've read about Project Blue Book and other official inquiries, but those seem to be historical footnotes now. Still, I can't shake the feeling that there's more going on behind the scenes. Appalachia is riddled with old coal mines, caverns, and places most people never tread. It's the perfect setting for secrets to remain buried. I've also stumbled onto accounts of people who mention being followed by black SUVs or men in suits after they share their stories. That hasn't happened to me, and I hope it never does. I'd rather stay out of the spotlight. I'm just someone who encountered something unusual and can't neatly explain it away. I'm not trying to make money off this or become part of some sideshow. I just want others who might have seen the same thing, or had the same creeping dread at 3 a.m., to know they're not alone. Sometimes I consider driving back to all the spots. My dad's backyard, the stretch of highway, the edges of the Ohio River near Gallipolis Ferry, just to see if I can replicate the sightings. Then I realize how futile that might be. These events seem to happen when you're not looking for them, when you least expect it. That in itself is part of what makes them so unsettling. It's the notion that, at any moment, reality can throw you a curveball that flips everything you think you know about the world. I still keep my journal, though I write in it less frequently nowadays. Life goes on, and routine often overshadows the unexplained. But every so often I'll be out in the yard late at night and pause to scan the skies for that metallic glint, or I'll turn off the TV in the living room and stand in total silence, listening for that faint humming or crackling at the window. I haven't had a direct encounter in a while, and maybe that's for the best. My nerves could use the break, yet some part of me remains curious, hungry even, for answers. That's the story so far, or at least the version of it I can cobble together. I don't have tidy explanations or definitive conclusions, just a collection of memories and feelings, intangible evidence of something that exists outside the normal day-to-day. If you've experienced anything similar, whether it's lights in the sky, missing time, or an unshakable sense of being watched in the darkness, then maybe you'll read this and realize our world might be a little weirder than we'd like to admit. And if you haven't had such encounters, maybe this will at least make you think twice next time you drive along the Ohio River, or glance out your bedroom window late at night. Sometimes the strange and the unexplained are closer than we realize.